The big story today, though, is what's happening in the oil patch after some fresh commentary from world leaders. Oil prices actually spiking after French President Emmanuel Macron was caught on camera in conversation with President Joe Biden at the G7, relaying a conversation he had with the ruler of the UAE about spare production capacity. If you haven't seen this, you need to watch it. Look at this right now.
He told me two things. One, I'm at the maximum. This is what he claimed, and he told me this is my complete commitment. Second, he told me, according to us, the Saudis can increase a little bit, but 150 or a little bit more, and they don't have huge capacities. And this is before 6 months' time.
So let's get straight out to Hadley Gamble in Madrid for reaction and analysis on this. And Hadley, they've cracked it. And look, old news must travel pretty slow in France because tell us something we don't know, right? Macron's really excited exchange with the president has been mocked online. It's even been joked about at the highest levels of OPEC because it seems to show basically a lack of understanding about what we would call a known in the oil and energy market dynamic. Good morning to you. Your reaction?
Good morning, Dan. Standing here on the streets of Madrid, where, by the way, everyone seems to be just getting home from the bars, except for yours truly. So basically what we saw yesterday between this exchange between presidents, seemingly the blind leading the blind. I mean, how do these guys not know this already? Hasn't this been something that's been under discussion over the last several months when we've been talking about getting Russian oil and gas off of the table? One would think, given the news flows that we've seen, that this was a subject of major concern, not just for the U.S. president, of course, but for the president of France. Now, as you know, just a couple of weeks from now, U.S. President Joe Biden is going to be headed to Saudi Arabia as well as Israel, and he's expected to have those energy conversations with the de facto leader of OPEC, Saudi Arabia. One has to wonder where the big surprise was there for President Macron, Dan.
Exactly, Hadley. And I think the urgency of that conversation really lowers already low expectations when it comes to Biden's visit to the Middle East. So a lot at stake here, particularly in the energy and oil market dynamic, but also wanted to flag the reaction that we've seen from some OPEC members, including the UAE energy minister, who took to Twitter pretty quickly just to clarify some of the comments that he heard from Emmanuel Macron in exchange with the US President Joe Biden there. He said that the UAE is producing near maximum production capacity based on that OPEC production baseline. And remember, this deal expires in the next few months. OPEC has already agreed to pump nearly 650,000 more barrels per day in July and in August. And it's pretty unlikely that we're going to get more of a commitment from them when OPEC meets this week. But of course, this isn't the only factor influencing oil right now. We also have G7 leaders talking about a potential price cap on Russian crude, certainly something that's also been dismissed by some of these leaders.
Absolutely. And you know, Dan, one of the things that we've also been reading about in the last 24 hours was this meeting of EU energy ministers essentially saying that they want to come out with a plan, a concept, if you will, that would be European-wide, that would essentially be an informal or a formal way, frankly, for consumers to consume less and for industry to understand exactly how much leverage or how much room they have to wiggle here. And I'm talking about the amount of energy that goes into industry. I'm talking about whether or not they're going to have to go ahead and institute caps themselves. And you've got to think about this with regards to the bigger picture. This is politics, this is jobs, this is whether or not these folks in office at this moment are going to be able to get reelected the next time around, and how long, frankly, consumers are going to be willing to foot the bill for this conflict in Ukraine.
Exactly, particularly given the domestic pressure that these G7 leaders are under when it comes to growth and inflation. But Hadley, shifting focus, you are, of course, in Madrid, all ready for the NATO summit. The substance of the talks at the G7 has really been about showing unity and resolve around Ukraine. So what's the focus on the ground there in Madrid as the NATO summit kicks off?
Well, essentially what we heard from Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, in his remarks yesterday, really setting this one up, is that they want to announce a new concept or a new strategy for NATO. Now, for the very first time, China is listed as a concern for the group. You know, I've been talking to the Secretary General about China for years and years now, but there was always seemingly a bit of a muddled response from NATO allies about just how to deal with the threat from the East, if you will. It was interesting that in his remarks yesterday, the Secretary General essentially saying that while China is an area of concern, Russia does remain the greatest single threat to NATO allies' security. Now, we're talking about 1 billion people essentially there. He also said that in order to get to where there is a sense of safety or security more broadly on those eastern borders, that they want to increase their high readiness force to 300,000. Currently, the rapid response force sits at 40,000. So this is a massive increase. He was talking about putting more battalions on the ground. He was talking about increased readiness and forward deployment. One question, of course, that folks are already beginning to raise in terms of where those troops are going to come from, who's going to be contributing the bulk of them. He was very proudly citing the massive increase in spending by NATO members up to that 2% threshold that they've seen since 2014. You remember that was all galvanized, frankly, when former U.S. President Donald Trump came to NATO summit in Brussels and essentially says, you guys have got to get your act together, and questioned even at that time the thoughtfulness, if you will, of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and whether or not Germany and other European countries should essentially be spending billions of dollars even then on Russian energy at the cost of security. Dan?
Yeah, exactly, Hadley. And just when it comes to the situation on Ukraine, we've also heard from President Zelensky, who told G7 leaders that he wants this war over by the end of the year. Do you think that's a realistic timeline?
That's a big question, isn't it? Because essentially when I spoke with the Secretary General just a month or so ago at Davos, I said, how long can the Russian president continue to fund his war machine? Because we've seen the ruble stabilize. We've seen the Russian mind meld really setting in there in a very nationalistic way. I mean, even folks, as you know, who were not in support of this conflict came out to walk in the streets the day that they had their anniversary parade. And part of this, of course, is the idea that in a post-Soviet country, there are generations of people who were able to survive on next to nothing for years at a time. This is a very different situation in Europe and the United States, where we're talking about deep concern over consumption cuts when it comes to energy, gas, oil. And as you said, the price cap, clear questions about how that would actually work. I can't wait to speak to Steve a little later in the program about that fantastic interview with Fatih Birol. But one of the big questions, of course, going forward is how this is going to play out in terms of the strength of defensive readiness. Listen in to what the Secretary General had to say.
At the summit, we will strengthen our forward defenses. We will enhance our battle groups in the eastern part of the alliance up to brigade levels. We will transform the NATO response force and increase the number of our high readiness forces to well over 300,000.
So later today, I will be speaking in an exclusive interview with the Secretary General. We're going to be focusing, frankly, on energy, on climate change, and how that all plays into the NATO strategy going forward. And Dan, at the end of the day, you've got to remember that, of course, this is Europe. We're sitting in the heart of sort of the green energy belt, if you will. And a lot of folks are deeply, deeply concerned that everything that we're seeing happening in the energy markets is going to derail the moves toward climate change and the transition. NATO has some ideas about how to make sure and ensure that that does not happen. We're going to be speaking to him later today. Also got the chance to sit down with Annalena Baerbock, of course, the defense minister of Germany, and I'm also going to be speaking as well to the Prime Minister of Iceland,